Hey there! Tonight, we're stepping into a world of silk and secrets, of privilege wrapped in propriety, of wealth measured not just in gold, but in acres, titles, and the number of servants who knew your name. This isn't the Victorian England you learned about in school, all industrial progress and moral reform. This is the life lived behind wrought iron gates and heavy curtains, where an improperly addressed letter could ruin a reputation, and the wrong fork at dinner might cost you a marriage proposal. We're going inside the life of the Victorian elite, where every moment was choreographed, every interaction calculated, and where being born into the right family meant you'd never have to work a day in your life, but you'd spend every waking hour performing one. If these calm tales from the past help you drift into dreams, you can like and subscribe, but only if they truly calm your mind. And if you'd like to help our peaceful historical channel grow, your support means more than you imagine. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, the time on your clock, and if you still have a little sleepy hype remaining, send it our way. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same slow march through history. So, dim the lights. Let the crackle of a Victorian hearth warm your imagination. Settle in, and let's begin with what it truly meant to be among the fortunate few. The Victorian era stretched from 1837 to 1901, 64 years under the reign of Queen Victoria herself. But for the elite, for those who sat at the very top of society's impossibly rigid pyramid, time moved differently. Their world wasn't measured in years, but in seasons, in social calendars that repeated with the predictability of church bells. Spring meant London. Summer meant country estates. Autumn meant house parties and shooting. Winter meant more London, more balls, more carefully orchestrated encounters that decided the futures of daughters and the alliances of families. The elite weren't simply rich. Plenty of people had money by the Victorian age. The new industrialists, the merchants, the factory owners who'd ridden the wave of Britain's manufacturing dominance to wealth beyond imagination. But money alone didn't make you elite. The truly elite had something money couldn't buy. Quickly, at least, not in a single generation. They had titles. They had land that stretched beyond the horizon. They had family trees that could be traced back centuries through civil wars and coronations, through marriages arranged by monarchs and estates granted by grateful kings. They had names that opened doors before a word was spoken. To be born into the upper echelons of Victorian society was to inherit not just wealth, but an entire apparatus of privilege, a machine of social power that had been refined over centuries. You were born into houses with 50 rooms or more. You had servants whose grandparents had served your grandparents. You attended schools where the sons of earls and dukes had studied for 300 years. You married within your class, preserving bloodlines and consolidating estates. You sat in Parliament not through election, but by birthright. You controlled vast swaths of British countryside, and the people who farmed it called you master. The aristocracy sat at the very pinnacle. These were the titled nobility, the dukes and duchesses, the earls and countesses, the viscounts and barons. They made up perhaps 1% of 1% of the population, but they controlled nearly a quarter of all the land in Britain. Their incomes came not from work, but from rents collected from tenant farmers, from investments, from the sheer accumulated wealth of inheritance. A duke might enjoy an annual income of £10,000 or more, the equivalent of over £1 million in modern money, and he wouldn't lift a finger to earn it. Below the titled aristocracy sat the gentry, the landed families without titles but with influence all the same. They were still undeniably elite, still part of the ruling class. Their sons went to the same schools, married into the same families, moved through the same social circles. They might not have coronets on their carriages, but they had everything else that mattered. This was a world built on inheritance, on primogeniture, on the careful preservation of estates through generations. The eldest son inherited everything: the title, the land, the London townhouse, the family jewels. Younger sons were expected to find their own way, usually through the church, the military, or, if absolutely necessary, the law. Daughters inherited nothing. Their value lay entirely in whom they married, in the alliances they could forge, in the dowries they brought and the sons they produced. You didn't choose this life. You were born into it. And from the moment you drew your first breath in a bedroom larger than most people's homes, attended by a doctor who'd been paid more for that single visit than a working family earned in a month, your path was laid out before you. You would be educated, trained, prepared. You would learn to move through society with the ease of someone who'd never questioned their right to be there. You would marry well. You would produce heirs. You would manage estates and attend Parliament and host dinners that cost more than a laborer's yearly wage. And you would do it all while making it look effortless, natural, as if you'd been born for this. Because you had. The gulf between the elite and everyone else wasn't just economic. It was social, cultural, almost biological in how it was perceived. The upper classes didn't just have more money. They believed they were fundamentally different, better, more refined, more civilized. They spoke differently, with accents carefully cultivated at exclusive schools. They dressed differently, in clothes that cost fortunes and required servants to put on and take off. They ate differently, with elaborate rituals around food that seemed designed specifically to exclude anyone who didn't know the rules. They even smelled different, bathed more frequently, used imported soaps and perfumes, while the working classes often went weeks without washing. The elite moved through a world of their own creation, insulated from the realities that shaped most people's lives. They'd never stood in line for anything. They'd never waited for service. They'd never been told no by someone they couldn't simply dismiss or ruin with a word. The doors of the finest establishments opened before them. The best boxes at the opera were theirs by right. The most fashionable addresses in London were where they lived. And if someone new and wealthy tried to move in, they were quietly but firmly reminded that money couldn't buy acceptance. But this life, this world of breathtaking privilege, came with its own chains. Every freedom bought with wealth was balanced by an obligation born of class. You couldn't simply do as you pleased. You had to maintain appearances. You had to follow rules so complex that entire books were written about them. You had to marry the right person, associate with the right families, attend the right events. A scandal could ruin generations. A misstep could close every door in society. The pressure to perform your role correctly, to be the perfect aristocrat, the ideal gentleman or lady, was immense and unrelenting. So yes, you had servants, you had estates, you had more money than you could possibly spend. But you also had expectations, duties, responsibilities that weighed on you like the elaborate clothes you wore. You were not just living your life. You were maintaining a position, upholding a system, embodying an ideal that had been centuries in the making. This was the Victorian elite. Not the villains of Dickens' novels, though some surely were villainous. Not the heroes of romance, though some surely were romantic. Just people, born into extraordinary circumstances, trying to navigate a world that demanded perfection while offering everything except true freedom. And it all began, as it always does, at the very beginning, with birth. You are born in the master bedroom of a great house, a room that's been prepared for weeks. The family doctor attends, a man who's delivered babies for your parents' friends and who charges fees that would feed a working family for half a year. Your mother, if she's fashionable, has been confined for weeks before your arrival, seeing no one but her closest family and lady's maid. The birth itself is attended by nurses, by the doctor, by your mother's personal maid. Your father paces somewhere downstairs, probably in the library with a drink, waiting for news. When you arrive, if you're a boy, there's champagne. Letters are written immediately to family, to friends. Announcements are prepared for the Times. If you're a girl, there's still pleasure, of course, but perhaps a little less champagne. A daughter is wonderful, but a son is essential. A son inherits. A son carries on the name. A son is the whole point. Your first moments are not in your mother's arms. That's not how it's done in elite families. You're taken by the nurse, cleaned, examined, and then presented to your mother for a brief, formal moment before being whisked away to the nursery. This will be your home for years, not with your parents, but with your nurse, in rooms at the top of the house, far from the elegant drawing rooms and dining halls where adult life unfolds. The nursery is a self-contained world. There's a day nursery where you play, a night nursery where you sleep, and adjoining rooms for your nurse, and later for the nursery maid who helps her. The rooms are comfortable, but not lavish. Your parents' bedroom might have silk wallpaper and paintings by masters, but the nursery has sensible paint and furniture built to withstand children. You have toys, more than any child could need. Imported dolls and tin soldiers and rocking horses carved from fine wood. But you also have rules. Routine is everything. Your nurse runs the nursery with the efficiency of a general commanding troops. There are set times for waking, for breakfast, for lessons, for play, for walks, for tea, for bed. You follow this schedule as religiously as your parents follow the social calendar. Your nurse is not your mother, but in many ways she raises you more than your mother does. She dresses you, feeds you, puts you to bed, comforts you when you cry, disciplines you when you misbehave. She's with you constantly. Your mother visits, usually once or twice a day at prescribed times. You're brought down to the drawing room in the late afternoon, dressed in your best clothes, told to be good. You sit with your mother for an hour, maybe two. You show her what you've learned, recite a poem perhaps, or demonstrate your progress at the piano. She asks questions. She smiles. She might even embrace you, though never with the casual affection your nurse shows. And then you're taken back upstairs. Your mother has dinner to dress for, guests to receive, a life that doesn't revolve around children. If your father acknowledges you at all in these early years, it's brief. A pat on the head as he passes in the hall. A moment in his study where you're brought to demonstrate good behavior. Fathers, especially in the highest families, maintain distance from their children. They're not meant to be playmates or confidants. They're meant to be authorities, distant figures who provide and discipline, but don't get down on the floor to play. You might spend more time with your father's valet than with your father himself. You see your parents most at breakfast, if you're old enough. Elite families don't gather for every meal like common folk. But breakfast is different. It's held in the dining room, a massive spread set out on the sideboard. Eggs and bacon and kippers and toast and marmalade and porridge. Your mother might still be in her dressing gown. Your father reads the paper. You sit quietly, eating what you're given, speaking only when spoken to. It's training. Every moment is training for the life you'll lead. As you grow from infant to child, the nursery regime becomes more structured. If you're a boy, you might get toy soldiers to teach you about military matters, since younger sons often go into the army. If you're a girl, you get dolls to prepare you for motherhood, and toy tea sets to teach you how to pour properly. Play is not just play, it's preparation. By age 4 or 5, lessons begin in earnest. A governess might be hired for the girls, a tutor for the boys if they're not yet old enough for school. You learn to read from expensive books. You learn to write with proper copperplate handwriting. You learn history, though it's the history of great men and battles, not of ordinary people. You learn geography, with special attention to the pink bits on the map, the British Empire, which you're told is the greatest force for civilization the world has ever known. If you're a girl, your education focuses on accomplishments. You learn French, because French is the language of culture. You learn to play the piano, or perhaps the harp. You learn to sing, though not too loudly. You learn to draw and paint, watercolors being particularly suitable for ladies. You learn needlework, though you'll never have to mend your own clothes. This is about creating beautiful, useless things that demonstrate your leisure and refinement. You learn to dance with a dancing master who comes to the house to teach you the waltz and the quadrille. Most importantly, you learn deportment, how to sit, how to stand, how to walk. You practice balancing books on your head to improve your posture. You learn to move with grace, even in the heavy, elaborate dresses you'll wear. You learn to curtsy, which is harder than it looks. You learn that a lady never hurries, never shouts, never shows too much emotion or enthusiasm. If you're a boy, your early education is broader. You learn Latin and Greek, because a gentleman must read the classics in their original languages. You learn mathematics, though you'll probably never need it. Estate stewards handle the accounts. You learn about government and law, because you might sit in Parliament one day. You learn to ride, starting young, because riding is what gentlemen do. You might learn to fence. You certainly learn to shoot, because shooting is the primary sport of the elite. But for all the lessons, for all the time with tutors and governesses, your real education is in observation. You watch your parents. You see how they speak to servants, always polite but never familiar. You see how they interact with each other, with formal courtesy that never quite becomes warmth. You see how they dress, how they move through rooms, how they command without seeming to command. You absorb the unspoken rules, the things that are never explicitly taught but must be learned. Don't speak to servants about personal matters. Don't befriend children outside your class. Don't show excitement or disappointment too openly. Don't eat too quickly. Don't laugh too loudly. Don't run in the house. Don't. The list is endless. Childhood in an elite Victorian household is not unhappy, not exactly. You have everything material could provide. But it's also not the carefree experience of children in other classes, who might run wild through streets or fields with minimal supervision. Your life is scheduled, supervised, corrected. You're being molded into something specific. If you're lucky, you have siblings close in age. The nursery might house 3 or 4 of you. And while you're not encouraged to be too rowdy, at least you have companionship. You form alliances against your nurse. You play games that your governess doesn't know about. You have secrets, small rebellions. Some children grow close to their nurses and remain attached to them for life. Others count the days until they're old enough to escape the nursery. Girls might stay in this world until they're 16 or 17. Boys escape sooner, sent away to school. But we'll get to that. The nursery is warm in winter, thanks to fires kept constantly going by servants you rarely see. It's cool in summer, with windows open to let in air. You hear the sounds of the house around you, footsteps in halls, doors closing, the distant murmur of adult conversation. But you're separate from it all. You're being prepared, groomed, shaped for a future that's already decided. When you're very small, you might not understand that your life is different. But as you grow, as you venture beyond the nursery, as you're taken on walks through London streets or through the village near your country estate, you begin to see. You see the children in patched clothes staring at you. You see the men who pull off their caps as your nurse passes with you. You see the shopkeepers who bow and scrape when your mother comes to their establishments. You begin to understand that you're different, that the world treats you differently, that you have something others don't. And you begin to understand that this something comes with expectations. You're being raised not just to enjoy privilege, but to embody it, to be a proper gentleman or lady, to take your place in a system that has worked this way for centuries. This is your childhood, comfortable, structured, strange. And soon enough, it will end, because the next phase of your education is about to begin, and it will be considerably less gentle than the nursery regime. For boys, the real education begins around age 7 or 8. That's when you leave home, sent away to boarding school. The transition is abrupt, almost cruel. One day, you're in the nursery, surrounded by familiar faces. The next, you're in a carriage with your father, traveling to some drafty institution in the countryside where you'll live for the next 10 years. Your mother might cry when you leave, but not in front of you. That would be unseemly. Your father is brisk, businesslike. This is what's done. This is what his father did to him. This is how boys become men. Boarding schools for the elite, the great public schools like Eton, Harrow, Rugby, Winchester, were not gentle places. They were institutions designed to break you down and rebuild you into a proper English gentleman, capable of ruling an empire, commanding men, enduring hardship without complaint. The physical conditions were often appalling. You slept in dormitories with dozens of other boys, in beds that were little more than wooden boards with thin mattresses. The rooms were freezing in winter. There was no heating beyond a single fire that did nothing to warm a space meant for 50 boys. You washed in cold water. You ate food that was barely edible, boiled meat and potatoes, and puddings that sat in your stomach like stones. This was intentional. Luxury made you soft. Hardship built character. The academic education was rigorous but narrow. You studied classics primarily, Latin and Greek, reading Virgil and Homer until you could recite them in your sleep. Some mathematics, some history, mostly military history, a bit of modern languages, French and perhaps German. But the real curriculum wasn't academic. It was about learning to endure, learning to follow rules, learning your place in the hierarchy. Because public schools had their own elaborate social structures, as rigid and unforgiving as the class system outside. Older boys, the sixth formers, had immense power over younger boys. They could order you about, make you run errands, force you to perform menial tasks. This was called fagging, and it was an accepted part of school life. You were a fag to an older boy, his personal servant. You polished his shoes, fetched his meals, made his bed, did his homework if he demanded it. If you refused or failed, you were beaten. Not by masters, but by the older boys themselves, who had the right to discipline younger students. The beatings were ritual, almost ceremonial. You'd be called to the older boy's room. You'd be bent over a chair or desk, and you'd be hit with a cane hard enough to raise welts, hard enough that you wouldn't sit comfortably for days. Everyone knew it happened. Masters turned a blind eye. It was building character, teaching you to take punishment without complaint. Sports were mandatory and brutal. You played cricket in summer, football or rugby in winter. These weren't friendly games. They were violent, fierce competitions where broken bones were common, and concussions were just part of the experience. You played through injury, through pain. Showing weakness was unthinkable. If you were good at sports, school was easier. Athletes were admired, protected. If you were poor at sports but good at academics, you were a swot, looked down upon, likely to be bullied. The ideal was to be decent at both, but not too obviously keen on either. Earnestness was suspicious. The proper attitude was studied indifference, as if everything came easily. Friendships formed at these schools would last your entire life. The boys you shared a dormitory with, suffered alongside, fought beside in inter-school competitions, they became your network. Years later, you'd recognize each other at London clubs, at social events. You'd give each other jobs, support each other in business, marry your children to each other's children. Old school ties weren't just sentimental. They were the foundation of the old boys network that ran Britain. You left school at 18, shaped and scarred by the experience. You'd learned Latin and Greek, yes. You'd learned to think, somewhat. But mostly, you'd learned to conform, to take your place in the hierarchy, to endure, to rule, if necessary, with the casual cruelty that had been practiced on you. From public school, if you were destined for leadership, you went to Oxford or Cambridge. Not to study anything particular, not to prepare for a profession. You went because that's what was done. The universities were finishing schools for gentlemen, places where you made more connections, joined more clubs, learned to drink, to gamble, to accumulate debts your father would have to pay. Academically, you could coast. Many students did. The standards weren't particularly high, at least not for wealthy students whose families had been attending for generations. You joined a college, lived in ancient rooms, dined in medieval halls. You might attend lectures, or you might not. No one particularly cared. What mattered was that you were there, accumulating the patina of education that a gentleman required. You joined clubs, lots of clubs. Drinking clubs, debating societies, sporting clubs. At Oxford, you might row for your college. At Cambridge, you might join the Pitt Club or the Hawks Club, exclusive societies that admitted only the right sort. These clubs, like your school, became part of your identity. You'd wear their ties and brooches for the rest of your life. After 3 or 4 years, you'd graduate with a degree, perhaps in classics or history or law. The degree itself didn't matter much. What mattered was that you'd completed the circuit. Public school, Oxbridge, the season. You were now a fully formed gentleman, ready to take your place in society. For girls, education was entirely different. You didn't leave home for school. That would be unseemly, dangerous even. Instead, the schoolroom came to you, in the form of a governess. She lived in your house, usually in a room that was neither quite upstairs with the family, nor downstairs with the servants. Her position was awkward, liminal. She was educated, often from a good family that had fallen on hard times, but she was paid, which made her a servant. Yet she ate separately from the servants, sometimes taking meals alone in her room, sometimes grudgingly invited to dine with the family when no guests were present. She was neither one thing nor the other, and everyone, including her, felt the awkwardness of it. Your governess taught you the accomplishments expected of a lady. French, certainly. Possibly German or Italian. Music, with lessons at the piano every single day until you could play competently, if not brilliantly. Singing, though nothing too operatic. Drawing and painting, always in watercolors. History, but not too much. Geography, with focus on places you might visit on a grand tour. A bit of literature, carefully selected. Nothing too novel, nothing too stimulating. Your reading was monitored, curated. Sensation novels were forbidden. Even good novels were somewhat suspect. Better to read improving works, religious texts, poetry. But the real lessons were in deportment and accomplishment. You learned to sit still for hours, which was harder than it sounds when you were corseted and wearing skirts that weighed 10 pounds. You learned to make conversation without saying anything of substance. You learned to appear interested in whatever boring topic the gentleman beside you at dinner chose to discuss. You learned to play the piano well enough to entertain, but not so well that you seemed to be trying too hard. You learned to dance beautifully, which meant taking lessons with a dancing master who came to the house. You learned to manage servants, at least in theory. Your mother might take you with her when she gave household orders, teaching you to speak to the housekeeper and cook with the right mixture of authority and courtesy. You learned to plan menus, to arrange flowers, to write invitations and reply to them. You learned the elaborate rules of calling cards and visiting hours. Most importantly, you learned to be decorative. To dress beautifully, to style your hair, to sit with perfect posture, to be the kind of daughter who reflected well on her family, the kind who would make a good marriage. Some girls were sent to finishing schools for a year or two, usually on the continent. These establishments in Paris or Geneva or Florence promised to add polish, to teach you languages and culture. Really, they were holding pens before the marriage market, places where you could be supervised while learning to be even more accomplished. You'd return home at 16 or 17 fully prepared. And then you'd wait. Wait for the next phase. Wait for your presentation at court. Wait for your debut into society. Wait for the season. Wait, essentially, to be married off. Because that was the entire point of your education. Not to prepare you for a career, you'd never have one. Not to prepare you for independence, you'd never have that either. But to prepare you to be the perfect wife for a man of your class, to run his household, to bear his children, to be an ornament to his life. Your education was shorter than your brother's, less expensive, less rigorous, but it was every bit as carefully designed. You were being shaped for a role, just as he was. The only difference was that his role came with power, with choice, with freedom. Yours came with pretty dresses, and the hope that you'd marry well. And soon, very soon, you'd be thrust into the glittering, ruthless world where that marriage would be arranged. The London season was waiting, and you were about to discover that nothing you'd learned had quite prepared you for the brutal social competition that was about to begin. You are 17, maybe 18. The schoolroom is behind you. Your governess has departed or been reassigned to your younger sisters. Your hair, which you've worn down your back your entire life, is now pinned up in an elaborate style that takes your maid an hour to create. Your skirts, which used to brush the floor, now trail behind you. Your corset, always restrictive, is now laced even tighter to create the fashionable wasp-waisted silhouette. Everything about you has changed overnight. You are no longer a girl. You are a young lady. And you are about to be launched into society. This launch has a specific name, a specific ritual. You are going to be presented at court to make your debut before the Queen herself. This is not optional. Every girl of your class does it. It's the formal acknowledgement that you are now of marriageable age, now available, now on the market, though no one uses such crude terms. They speak of coming out, of entering society, of taking your place. But everyone knows what it really means. You are being displayed in the hope that someone suitable will want to buy, to marry, to claim you. Preparation for your presentation begins months in advance. You need the right dress, and the requirements are specific. It must be white or off-white, made of the finest silk or satin, with elaborate embroidery. The train must be a certain length, precisely measured, so it trails behind you just so when you walk, and can be gracefully swept up when you're not. You wear long white gloves, stretching above your elbows. You carry a bouquet of white flowers. And most distinctively, you wear 3 white ostrich feathers in your hair, positioned just so, the mark of a debutante. The feathers alone cost a fortune. The dress costs even more. But money is no object, not for this. This is the most important day of your young life, or so everyone tells you. Your mother, or perhaps another lady who was herself presented years ago, must present you. This is crucial. You cannot simply show up. You need a sponsor, someone to vouch for you, to literally present you to the monarch. In the Victorian era, under Queen Victoria herself, these presentations were held at Buckingham Palace during special drawing rooms, formal court occasions that happened several times during the season. On the appointed day, you and your mother dress with excruciating care. Your maid has been up since before dawn preparing. Your hair must be perfect. Your dress must be spotless. The feathers must be angled precisely. Any mistake, any smudge or wrinkle, and you'll be the talk of society for all the wrong reasons. You arrive at the palace in your family's finest carriage, joining a long line of other carriages filled with other nervous debutantes and their mothers. The wait can be hours. You sit, trying not to wrinkle your dress, trying not to sweat in your tightly laced corset, trying not to panic. Inside the palace, you're ushered through magnificent rooms. You rehearsed this, but reality is overwhelming. The gilded ceilings, the enormous paintings, the footmen in their livery, the ladies in waiting in their court dresses, all of it is designed to awe and intimidate. And then you're in the presence chamber. The Queen is there. Or later in the reign, the Prince and Princess of Wales might preside if Victoria isn't attending. You wait your turn, watching other girls go before you, seeing how they do it. And then your name is called. Your mother goes first, curtsying deeply, a full court curtsy that takes practice to do without toppling over. Then it's your turn. You step forward. You've practiced this 100 times, but suddenly your legs feel like water. You manage to walk the required steps forward. You curtsy, sinking low, keeping your balance despite the weight of your train. You kiss the Queen's hand, or you pretend to. your lips hovering just above her glove. You rise, you back away, never turning your back on the monarch, while somehow managing to keep from tripping over your own train. And then it's done. You're out of the presence chamber. You've been presented. You're officially out in society. The presentation is just the beginning. It opens the door to the season, that 3-month whirlwind of social events from May through July that defines upper-class London life. During the season, every elite family decamps to their London townhouse. The great houses in Mayfair and Belgravia, which might sit empty much of the year, suddenly come alive. Servants arrive en masse to open the houses, polish the silver, air the rooms. Your family's London residence might be a 4-story Georgian townhouse with a ballroom, multiple drawing rooms, a dining room that seats 30, and bedrooms for family and guests. It's staffed by an army of servants because during the season you'll be hosting constantly and being hosted constantly. The pace is relentless. Every day there are events, sometimes multiple events. Mornings might be relatively quiet, time for riding in Hyde Park, for making calls on other families, for preparation for the evening's entertainment. But afternoons and evenings are packed. There are afternoon teas, garden parties, musicals, visits to art exhibitions. There are balls, dozens of them, each hosted by a different prominent family, each requiring a different elaborate gown. There are dinners, enormous multi-course affairs that last for hours. There are nights at the opera, at the theater. There are trips to Ascot for the racing, to Henley for the regatta. You attend these events not for fun, though some of them are fun, but because this is work. This is the marriage market in action. Every event is a chance to be seen, to meet eligible men, to make connections. Your mother manages your social calendar like a military campaign. Which invitations to accept, which to decline. Which events will have the right sort of young men in attendance? Which families are seeking matches for their sons? You are chaperoned constantly. Never, ever are you alone with a man who isn't family. Your mother or a married aunt or someone is always there, watching, listening. Conversations with men are carefully supervised. They can ask you to dance. You can accept if your dance card isn't already full. You can speak with them in drawing rooms, but never privately. You cannot go for a walk alone with a man. You cannot ride alone with a man. You cannot, in fact, do anything alone with a man until you're engaged. The rules are strict, and everyone knows them. Breaking them means scandal, and scandal means you might not marry at all. Dancing is the primary form of social interaction. A ball might feature a dozen dances, waltzes and quadrilles and polkas. Your dance card, a small booklet attached to your wrist with a ribbon, lists each dance. Men approach, ask to sign your card, to reserve a dance. Having a full card is the goal. It means you're popular, sought after. Having empty spaces on your card is humiliating, advertising that you're a wallflower, that men aren't interested. During dances, you can speak more freely than in other settings. The music covers your words somewhat. The movement of the dance gives you brief moments of relative privacy. This is where courtship begins, if it begins at all. Over the course of multiple balls, you might dance repeatedly with the same man. This is significant. It suggests interest. If a man dances with you twice in one evening, people notice. Gossip starts. Is he courting her? If a man calls on your family the day after dancing with you, it's a clear signal of interest. Your mother will receive him in the drawing room, with you present, of course, and you'll make stilted conversation over tea while she evaluates his suitability. The pressure is immense. You're competing against every other debutante that season. In a good year, there might be a few hundred young women, all seeking husbands from a much smaller pool of eligible men. You need to stand out, but not too much. Be pretty, but not vain. Be accomplished, but not intimidating. Be charming, but not forward. Be interested in what men say, but not so educated that you threaten them. It's a tightrope walk, and you're performing it while corseted, in shoes that pinch, wearing dresses so elaborate that you need help getting in and out of them. Some girls meet someone in their first season and are engaged by the end of it. This is ideal. A quick, suitable match with a man of appropriate rank and means. Others take 2 or 3 seasons. Each year you fail to find a husband, your value on the market decreases. By your 3rd or 4th season, you're in danger of becoming a spinster, that dreaded designation. And your family is spending fortunes on this. Your wardrobe alone costs hundreds of pounds. Ball gowns, day dresses, riding habits, all of them fashionable, all of them expensive. Your family must host balls and dinners, which cost even more. Champagne flows, elaborate meals are served, orchestras are hired. All of this to attract a suitable husband for you. Marriage isn't about love, though love is nice if it happens. Marriage is about alliance, about property, about producing heirs. Your parents want you to marry someone of equal or better rank, someone whose family is respectable, whose estate is prosperous. The man's feelings matter more than yours. If he's interested, if he's suitable, you're expected to accept. You might barely know him. You've danced a few times, had a few chaperoned conversations. But that's considered enough. Because marriage isn't about knowing someone. It's about doing your duty to your family. When an offer comes, and if you're lucky and pretty and accomplished and fortunate, one will, your father accepts or declines based on practicalities. Is the match appropriate? What will the man inherit? What does his family bring to the alliance? If your father accepts, you're informed. Not asked, informed. You're expected to be pleased, grateful even, and then you're engaged. The engagement is announced in the papers. Congratulations pour in. You're given jewels, lots of them, from your new fiancé's family. There are parties to celebrate. And you're allowed, finally, to spend a bit more time with your betrothed, though still chaperoned. You might go for drives in the park, always with a chaperone in the carriage. You might visit his family estate. But you're never alone with him until your wedding night. The wedding is another enormous production, another chance for both families to display their wealth and status. The ceremony is at a fashionable church, St. George's, Hanover Square, or St. Margaret's, Westminster. You wear white, another elaborate gown, another fortune spent. The church is filled with flowers, with guests in their finest clothes. Afterward, there's a wedding breakfast at your family's house, Though it's not actually breakfast, it's a massive meal with multiple courses and endless champagne. And then you leave, whisked away, to begin married life, to a home you might never have seen before, with a man you barely know, to perform duties no one has quite explained to you. This is the season. This is courtship. This is how marriages happen in the upper echelons of Victorian society. It's not romantic, not usually. It's a transaction, a business deal dressed in silk and roses. But it's what every girl of your class goes through. It's the culmination of your entire education, your entire childhood. Everything has been leading to this. And now it's done. You're married. And the next phase of your life, the daily reality of being a Victorian elite wife, is about to begin. Marriage doesn't change your circumstances as much as you might have expected. You're still under male authority, just your husband's instead of your father's. You still live in enormous houses filled with servants. You still dress elaborately and attend social events and follow endless rules. But now you have a household to manage, and that is no small task. Running an elite Victorian household is a full-time job, though you're never called a worker. Ladies don't work. But the management required is extensive, complex, demanding. A large household might employ 30 or 40 servants, possibly more. Each has their role, and you must oversee all of it. Not directly, that would be unseemly. You work through your housekeeper, who manages the female servants, and your butler, who manages the male servants. But ultimately, the household is your responsibility. Your housekeeper comes to you every morning in your sitting room for consultation. She reports on household matters, asks for decisions about menus, about purchases, about which rooms need attention. You keep household accounts, thick ledgers tracking every expense. A shilling spent on lamp oil, £2 spent on wine for the cellar, 10 shillings for a new parlour maid's uniform. It adds up to hundreds of pounds a year, and you must account for all of it to your husband. Your day begins late by working-class standards, but that's because your evening probably didn't end until after midnight. You wake around 9, maybe 10 if the previous night was particularly late. Your lady's maid has been up for hours preparing. She brings you tea in bed, helps you dress for the day. Dressing takes an hour. There are layers, so many layers. First, your undergarments, chemise and drawers. Then your corset, which your maid laces tight, pulling the laces until you can barely breathe, until your waist is cinched to the fashionable measurement. Then petticoats, multiple petticoats, to give your skirt its shape. Then finally the dress itself, a morning dress that's simpler than your evening wear, but still elaborate by any reasonable standard. Your hair is styled, pinned up elaborately. Jewelry is selected. Only then are you ready to face the day. You breakfast in the morning room or the dining room, where food is laid out on the sideboard. Multiple choices: eggs and bacon and kippers, toast and preserves, porridge if you want it. You eat lightly. Your corset doesn't allow for large meals. Your husband might breakfast with you, or he might already be out, riding in the park or dealing with estate business. If he's there, you make conversation. You ask about his plans. You discuss the day's schedule. Intimate conversation is rare. You're polite to each other, cordial even, but not necessarily close. After breakfast, you deal with correspondence. Letters arrive constantly, and you must reply to all of them. Invitations to accept or decline, notes of thanks for dinners attended, condolence letters for deaths in acquaintances' families. You write in a specific style, using the right paper, the right phrases. Every word is calculated. A misstep in correspondence can cause offense. Mid-morning, you might receive visitors, or you might go calling yourself. This is an elaborate ritual. You dress for going out, changing into a walking dress and adding a hat and gloves. You take your carriage to visit other ladies in their homes. But you can't just arrive. There are calling hours, specific times when it's appropriate to visit, usually between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. You arrive, present your card to the butler who answers the door. If the lady of the house is receiving, you're shown to the drawing room. If she's not, or if she's simply not interested in seeing you, the butler informs you that she's not at home, even if you know perfectly well she is. This is how social snubs are delivered, through the polite fiction of being not at home. If you're received, you sit in the drawing room for 15 to 20 minutes, never longer. You're offered tea. You make conversation about neutral topics, the weather, recent social events, mutual acquaintances. You don't discuss anything personal or controversial. Politics, religion, money, all forbidden. After the appropriate time, you leave, thanking your hostess, and then you move on to the next house on your list. You might make 5 or 6 calls in an afternoon. Alternatively, you might be the one receiving calls. Your drawing room is prepared. Tea is ready. The fire is lit if it's winter. Flowers are arranged. And you sit, waiting to see who arrives. The butler announces each visitor. You greet them graciously, whether you like them or not. You make the same neutral conversation. You pour tea. You ensure everyone is comfortable. And you mentally note who came and who didn't, because attendance matters. Being popular means many people call on you. Being unpopular means empty afternoons. Luncheon might be taken in the dining room, or if you're alone, in your sitting room. It's a light meal, usually cold meats, cheese, bread. You don't eat heavily in the middle of the day. There's dinner to prepare for, and you need room in your corseted stomach. The afternoon might involve other activities. You might go shopping on Bond Street, though a lady never carries her own purchases. The shopkeeper arranges delivery. You might visit an exhibition at the Royal Academy. You might take a drive in the park. All of these activities are done with purpose. You're being seen. You're maintaining your social presence. You're doing the work of being an elite lady. By late afternoon, you're home, preparing for the evening. And the evening is when your real work begins. If you're hosting a dinner, and you host many, the preparation is extensive. The menu was planned days ago in consultation with your cook. Today, the table must be set, the seating arranged, the flowers positioned. You oversee all of it, ensuring perfection. Nothing can be out of place. The wrong wine glass, a crooked napkin, flowers that clash with the china. Any of these mistakes reflects poorly on you. Guests arrive at the appointed hour. You receive them in the drawing room, greeting each one personally. Your husband is there too, and together you play host and hostess. Conversation flows, wine is served, and then dinner is announced.
You process into the dining room in order of rank. The highest-ranking lady on your husband's arm. The highest-ranking gentleman escorting you. Everyone else follows in strict order. The table is a work of art. Crystal glasses catching candlelight. Silver serving pieces gleaming. China plates painted with family crests. Flowers arranged low so they don't obstruct conversation. And place cards, everyone seated according to rank and careful social calculation. Who should sit next to whom? Who should not be placed together? Dinner itself is an endurance test. 7, 8, sometimes 9 courses. Each one brought out with ceremony, served by footmen in livery. Soup, fish, meat, game, savory, cheese, dessert. Wine with each course, a different wine carefully selected. The meal lasts 3 hours or more. You're expected to eat delicately, to make conversation with the gentlemen seated to your left and right, to be charming and interested, even if you're bored senseless. After dessert, you lead the ladies from the room. The gentlemen remain, smoking cigars, drinking port, discussing business and politics. The ladies retire to the drawing room for tea and more conversation. Later, the gentlemen rejoin you. There might be music. Someone plays the piano, someone sings. There might be cards. Eventually, around midnight or later, guests begin to leave. You see them out, smiling, thanking them for coming, even if you're exhausted. And then finally, the house is quiet. You're helped out of your evening gown by your lady's maid. The corset is unlaced. You can breathe again. You put on your nightgown, and you collapse into bed knowing you'll do it all again tomorrow.
This is daily life for an elite Victorian woman. Exhausting, performing, never ending. You're on display constantly. Every action is observed, judged. You must be perfect, always. And if you fail, if you make mistakes, if you offend someone, or serve the wrong wine, or seat people incorrectly, you'll hear about it. Not directly, never directly, but through subtle social signals. Fewer invitations, cooler greetings. The knowledge that you've slipped, that your position is less secure than it was. Your husband's life is different. He has more freedom, more choices. He might work, though men of the highest rank often don't. His estate is managed by stewards. His investments are handled by men of business. He might sit in the House of Lords if he has a title. He might involve himself in politics or charitable causes. But he also has extensive leisure. He spends mornings at his club, reading papers, discussing politics with other gentlemen. He rides, he shoots, he hunts. He attends the same social events you do, but for him they're less stressful. He's not being judged on his hosting abilities or his conversation. He's simply expected to be there, to be respectable, to not cause scandal. The double standard is stark. He can have affairs, and probably does, and society turns a blind eye as long as he's discreet. You cannot. One hint of impropriety, and you're ruined. He can go where he pleases. You cannot go anywhere without a chaperone or your husband. He controls all the money. You have an allowance, which he can increase or decrease as he sees fit. You have no legal rights to your own property until the Married Women's Property Act late in Victoria's reign, and even then, change is slow. Yet, in some ways, you have power. You control the household. You decide which invitations to accept,
which families to cultivate. You can make or break social reputations through your approval or disapproval. You can refuse to receive certain people. You can spread or suppress gossip. Social power is real power, and you wield it carefully. You also bear children, and this is perhaps your most important duty, preferably sons, though daughters are necessary too for creating alliances through marriage. Childbirth is dangerous. Women die in childbirth regularly, even wealthy women with the best doctors. Every pregnancy is a risk, but you're expected to keep trying until you produce enough heirs. After children arrive, you don't raise them yourself. You've learned this from your own childhood. The nursery is set up, nurses are hired. You visit your children at appointed times, but they're not your daily concern. You have a household to run, a social position to maintain. Motherhood is important, but it doesn't consume you the way it might women of other classes. This is your life as a married woman of the elite, comfortable beyond measure, secure in ways most people never experience, but also constrained, performing, living according to rules you didn't make and can't change. You're powerful and powerless simultaneously, and you'll live this way until your husband dies, at which point you become a dowager, respected but increasingly irrelevant, expected to step back and let the next generation take center stage. For now, though, you have a dinner to plan and calls to make and a dress to choose for tonight's ball. The work of being elite never stops. If daily life is about routine and household management, fashion is about transformation. And in the Victorian era, fashion was not simply clothing. It was architecture, engineering, art, and torture, all wrapped into one elaborate package. What you wore defined who you were, broadcasted your wealth and status before you spoke a single word. And dressing, actually getting dressed, was an ordeal that could take hours and required at least one other person to accomplish. The foundation of every elite woman's outfit was the corset. This wasn't the delicate thing of later eras. This was a rigid contraption of whalebone or steel, lined with fabric, laced up the back with cords that needed to be pulled tight, impossibly tight. Your maid would brace her foot against your back and heave on the laces, compressing your torso until your waist measured 18 or 20 inches, even if your natural waist was 24. The pressure on your internal organs was immense. Breathing became shallow. Eating large meals became impossible. Fainting was common. So common that drawing rooms were always equipped with smelling salts. But the corset created the silhouette that fashion demanded, the wasp waist, the exaggerated hourglass figure. And so you wore it from morning until night, from the time you were a teenager until you were an old woman. Some women, it was rumored, slept in their corsets. After the corset came the chemise and drawers, then multiple petticoats to give your skirt its bell shape. In the mid-Victorian period, the crinoline became fashionable, a cage of steel hoops worn under your skirt to make it extend outward. These were remarkable engineering feats, allowing skirts to reach 6 feet in diameter without weighing 50 pounds. But they were also hazardous. Getting through doorways required careful maneuvering. Sitting down in a crinoline was an art form. You had to press down on the front hoops so the back didn't fly up and expose your legs. And there were tragic deaths when women got too close to fires and their crinolines caught. the flame spreading through the light fabric while they couldn't escape the cage around their legs. Later, the bustle replaced the crinoline, creating a different silhouette with all the volume pushed to the back. The bustle was smaller, easier to manage, but equally architectural. It was a wire frame attached at your waist, jutting out behind you, over which your skirts draped. Walking required adjusting your date. Sitting required perching on the front edge of chairs. Everything about women's fashion required adaptation, learning to move in ways that accommodated the clothes rather than clothes accommodating movement.
The dresses themselves were works of art. Morning dresses for wearing at home, relatively simple by Victorian standards, but still elaborate by any other measure. Walking dresses for going out during the day, made of sturdy fabrics in rich colors, trimmed with braid or fringe. Afternoon dresses for receiving visitors or paying calls, more ornate, with bustles and draping and decorative details. Evening dresses for dinners and balls, the most elaborate of all, made of silk or satin, with trains that swept the floor, with bodices cut low to show your shoulders and décolletage, with sleeves and trims that required hours of handwork. You owned dozens of these dresses, possibly over 100, and you were expected never to be seen in the same dress twice at major events. A ball gown worn to one event would not be worn to another that season. Fashion was rapid, ruthless. What was stylish in spring might be passé by autumn. You had to constantly acquire new clothes to stay current. Your wardrobe was a fortune in fabric and craftsmanship. Dressmakers were artists and treated as such. The best dressmakers, like Worth in Paris, charged astronomical sums and had waiting lists months long. But if you wanted to be fashionable, you went to Worth or one of the other renowned houses. You sat for fittings, hours of standing while fabric was pinned and adjusted. The dressmaker would have your measurements, would know your preferred colors, would suggest styles that suited you. Dozens of seamstresses would work on a single dress, hand-sewing every seam, attaching every bead and ribbon and button. Accessories were equally important and equally elaborate. Gloves, always gloves. You never went out without gloves. Different gloves for different occasions. Short kid gloves for daytime, long white gloves for evening. They had to fit perfectly, tight enough that they appeared like a second skin. Hats, enormous hats, decorated with ribbons and feathers and even entire taxidermied birds. The Victorians had no qualms about using animals for decoration. Jewels, lots of jewels. Your family jewels, passed down through generations. Diamonds, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, set in gold, worn in necklaces and earrings and bracelets and brooches. The more you wore, the wealthier you appeared. At evening events, elite women were dripping with jewels, their necks and wrists and hair glittering in candlelight. You changed clothes multiple times a day. The morning dress you wore at breakfast was not appropriate for receiving visitors in the afternoon. You changed into a different dress, requiring your maid to unlace your corset, help you out of one outfit, help you into another, relace your corset, style your hair differently. Then, before dinner, you changed again into evening wear. More unlacing, more help, more time. Getting dressed for a ball could take 2 hours. Your maid was essential.
A lady's maid was one of the most valued servants, paid well, treated with more respect than lower servants. She knew all your secrets. She saw you in your most vulnerable state. She dressed you, styled your hair, repaired your clothes, packed for trips, attended you at all times. A good lady's maid could make you look stunning. A poor one could ruin your appearance and thus your social standing. Men's fashion was less architecturally complex, but no less expensive and specific. Gentlemen wore different clothes for different times of day, different activities. Morning coat for business, frock coat for formal daytime events, tailcoat for evening. Each had specific accessories. The right shirt, the right tie or cravat, the right waistcoat, the right trousers. Shoes polished to a mirror shine. A top hat for going out, different hats for the country. A walking stick, gloves for going out. Everything had to be immaculate, perfectly tailored. Gentlemen employed valets, who performed the same function as ladies' maids, helping them dress, maintaining their clothes, ensuring they always looked impeccable. Fashion was not about comfort or practicality. It was about display. Your clothes announced that you didn't work, couldn't work in such garments. They announced that you could afford fortunes on fabric. They announced that you had servants to help you dress and maintain these elaborate outfits. They were armor, protection, and advertisement all at once. The lower classes tried to imitate elite fashion, buying cheaper versions of aristocratic styles. But it was always obvious. The fabric was inferior. The fit was wrong. The accessories were missing or cheap substitutes. A trained eye could determine someone's class at a glance, just from their clothes. This obsession with fashion had consequences. The money spent on clothes was money that didn't go to the poor or to charitable causes, though the elite also engaged in charity. The emphasis on appearance, on having the right look, created immense pressure. Women especially felt this pressure. You had to be beautiful, fashionably dressed, always perfect. No wonder so many turned to laudanum or other substances to cope with the stress. But fashion also created industries. Thousands of people were employed in textile production, in dressmaking, in millinery, in glove-making, in jewelry production. The elite's appetite for clothes supported a significant portion of the economy. And fashion was one area where women could exercise some choice, some creativity. You might have no control over whom you married or where you lived, but you could choose your dresses. Express yourself through color and style. Use fashion as a language to communicate with others who understood its subtleties. So you dressed every day in clothes that constrained and adorned you. You suffered through corsets and heavy skirts and pinching shoes. You spent hours in fittings and hours more being dressed. Because this was expected. This was what it meant to be a lady of quality, and appearance mattered more than comfort ever could.
If fashion was about individual presentation, etiquette was about navigating the social world without causing offense or being ostracized. And Victorian etiquette was baroque in its complexity, a maze of unwritten rules that everyone was expected to know and follow without question. One misstep, one breach of protocol could damage your reputation irreparably. The calling card was perhaps the most important tool in your social arsenal.
These small cards, printed with your name and address, were currency in the social world. You left them when making calls. You sent them with invitations. You received them from others. The cards themselves were specific: the right size, the right paper, the right font. Married women had their husband's name on their cards. Unmarried women had their own names. The rules for leaving cards were elaborate. When you called on someone, you left cards in the hall, handed to the butler. How many cards you left, whose cards, all of it signaled different things. If you were calling on a family for the first time, establishing contact, you left multiple cards. If it was a routine call, fewer cards. The butler collected these cards on a silver tray and presented them to the mistress of the house, who could glance and know immediately who had called that day. Visiting hours were sacrosanct. You could only call between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. Arriving earlier or later was presumptuous. When you called, you were not guaranteed entrance. The butler might inform you that the lady was not at home, which might be literally true, or might be a polite fiction, meaning she didn't want to see you. If you were received, the visit had to be exactly the right length, 15 to 20 minutes, rarely longer. Staying too long was rude. Leaving too quickly suggested you weren't enjoying yourself. You had to time it perfectly. During the visit, conversation followed strict rules. You talked about safe subjects: the weather, recent social events, mutual acquaintances. You didn't discuss anything controversial. Politics might be acceptable for men, but not for women. Religion was too divisive. Money was vulgar. Personal matters were too intimate. You skimmed the surface of life, making pleasant but meaningless conversation, demonstrating your ability to be sociable without being interesting. At dinner parties, seating arrangements were critical. Rank determined everything. The highest-ranking woman sat on the host's right, the second highest-ranking on his left. The highest-ranking man sat on the hostess's right, and so on down the table. You couldn't simply seat friends together or separate enemies. Rank came first. Getting the seating wrong was a serious breach that would be noticed and discussed. Table manners were equally elaborate. There were specific utensils for specific foods, multiple forks and knives and spoons around your plate in order of use. Start from the outside and work in was the general rule, but there were exceptions and variations. Using the wrong utensil was embarrassing. You ate slowly, delicately, never appearing hungry, even if you were starving. You didn't reach for things. If you wanted the salt, you asked for it to be passed. You didn't talk with your mouth full. You kept your elbows off the table. You placed your napkin in your lap, used it to dab your lips, never to wipe. Conversation at dinner was also regulated. You spoke to the person on your right for the first half of the meal, then turned to the person on your left for the second half. This was called turning the table, and the hostess initiated it by turning to speak to the man on her other side, signaling that everyone should switch conversation partners. Ignoring this rule and continuing to speak to the same person all evening was rude. Mourning had its own elaborate rules. When someone died, especially someone close, like a spouse or parent, you entered mourning, and the expectations were strict. For a widow, mourning lasted at least a year, often 2. You wore only black for the first year, deep black with no ornamentation. Your jewelry was jet, a black stone carved into brooches and beads. You couldn't attend social events. You couldn't go to the theater or opera. You couldn't even leave the house except for church and absolutely necessary errands. After the first year, you could move to half mourning, wearing gray or lavender, beginning to resume social activities slowly. Men's mourning was far less strict, maybe a black armband for a few months. But for women, mourning consumed years of your life and required an entire wardrobe of black clothes. Introductions followed complicated protocols. You couldn't introduce yourself to someone. You needed a mutual acquaintance to perform the introduction. Once introduced, you could acknowledge each other in public, but not before. If you saw someone you hadn't been introduced to at a party, you pretended not to see them, even if you'd encountered them multiple times. Young women especially were protected. They couldn't be introduced to just anyone. Their chaperones carefully controlled who they met, ensuring they were only introduced to appropriate, respectable people. An introduction to an unsuitable person could damage a girl's reputation. Engagement and marriage had their own rules. When you became engaged, it was announced publicly, usually in the Times. You could now be seen in public with your fiancé, though still chaperoned. You received congratulatory calls and gifts. But you couldn't be too affectionate in public. Kissing in public was absolutely forbidden. Even holding hands was questionable. You maintained propriety right up until the wedding day.
These rules were taught from childhood, reinforced constantly, and taken completely seriously. Breaking them wasn't just awkward, it was social death. You'd be cut, excluded, talked about in pitying or scandalized tones. Your family would be embarrassed. Your prospects for a good marriage would evaporate. And there was no guidebook, no written manual that listed all these rules. You learned by observation, by making small mistakes and being corrected, by absorbing the culture around you. This is why governesses were so important. They taught you the unwritten rules. This is why going to the wrong schools or associating with the wrong people was dangerous. You'd learn the wrong things. The minutiae of etiquette might seem absurd from a modern perspective. Why did it matter which fork you used or how many minutes you stayed on a call? But these rules served a purpose. They were barriers, ways of distinguishing the elite from everyone else. If you didn't know the rules, you didn't belong. It didn't matter how much money you had. The new industrialists, the wealthy merchants, they might have fortunes, but they didn't have breeding, didn't know the rules, and so they were excluded. Etiquette was gatekeeping, pure and simple. And within elite circles, etiquette maintained order. Everyone knew their place, knew how to behave around their superiors and inferiors. The system functioned smoothly because everyone followed the same invisible scripts. So you learned the rules, followed them meticulously, and judged others by how well they followed them too. You lived in a world of surfaces, of performances, where the right gesture at the right time mattered more than almost anything else. And you became very, very good at it, because you had no choice.
London was magnificent, glittering, the center of empire and high society. But for the elite, it was only part of the year. The rest of the time, you lived at your country estate. And this was an entirely different world. Pastoral, slower, but no less demanding. Country houses were not houses in any normal sense. They were enormous, sprawling complexes that could house 50 guests plus all the servants needed to attend them. A great country house might have 50 or 60 bedrooms, multiple drawing rooms, a ballroom, a library that took up an entire wing, dining rooms for different occasions, a billiard room, gun rooms, estate offices. And that was just the house. The estate itself stretched for thousands of acres, encompassing entire villages, farms worked by tenant farmers, hunting grounds, forests, lakes. These weren't just homes. They were kingdoms. And you were essentially royalty within your domain. The house was run by an army of servants, indoor and outdoor staff. Inside, you had the butler running the male servants, the housekeeper running the female servants. There were footmen in livery, housemaids who cleaned, laundry maids who washed mountains of linens, kitchen staff who prepared elaborate meals, ladies' maids and valets for family and important guests. Outside, you had stable staff caring for dozens of horses, gardeners maintaining acres of formal gardens and producing vegetables for the table, gamekeepers managing the hunting, foresters managing the woodlands, estate workers maintaining roads and fences and buildings. Everyone had their role, and the hierarchy was strict. Upper servants, like the butler and housekeeper, dined separately from lower servants. They had better rooms, better food, more authority. Lower servants ate in the servants' hall, shared cramped quarters in the attics, worked from before dawn until late at night. But even the lowest servant at a great house had some status. They worked for an important family. They weren't factory workers or farm laborers. And there was security in service, usually. As long as you did your job and didn't cause scandal, you had employment, housing, and food. Some families kept servants on even when they were too old to work, setting them up in cottages on the estate, giving them pensions. The servants knew every detail of your life. They dressed you, cleaned your room, handled your correspondence, served your meals. Privacy, as we understand it, didn't exist. But there was an understanding. Servants were supposed to be invisible, to know everything and say nothing. A good servant never gossiped about their employers, never revealed secrets. Breaking this code meant instant dismissal without references, which meant you'd never work in a good house again. The rhythm of country house life followed the seasons. Winter might be quieter, family and close friends, time for estate management and hunting. Spring meant preparing for the London season, closing up parts of the house, moving many servants to the London residence. Summer, after the season ended, meant house parties. This was when the country house came alive. You invited dozens of guests for weeks at a time, elaborate affairs that required massive preparation and coordination. House party guests weren't just entertained, they were pampered. Each guest had their own bedroom and perhaps a separate dressing room. Married couples were given separate bedrooms, which was actually convenient for discreet affairs. Each important guest had a lady's maid or valet assigned to attend them. If they didn't bring their own, your staff would be assigned to fill that role. Meals were lavish, endless courses, the finest wines from your cellar. But the real purpose of house parties was matchmaking and socializing. Unmarried young people were invited, chaperoned carefully, but given opportunities to interact. Guests spent their days shooting, riding the grounds. The men might hunt all day, while the women stayed back, reading or doing needlework or painting. Evenings were for elaborate dinners, for games, for musicals, for conversation.
Shooting parties were particularly important if you were a man. The elite shot game, pheasants, grouse, partridge, not for food, but for sport. Your gamekeeper spent all year managing the bird population, protecting them from poachers, ensuring there were plenty for your guests to shoot. On shooting days, the men would head out to the fields with their guns and dogs, accompanied by beaters who flushed the birds from cover. They'd shoot hundreds of birds in a single day, competing to see who was the best shot. The birds were collected, some sent to the kitchens, some given to guests to take home, some sold. Being a good shot was important for a gentleman. It demonstrated skill, coordination, and a proper masculine attitude toward sport and killing. Women didn't shoot, with rare exceptions, but they might watch from a distance, might join the men for the shooting lunch set up in a pavilion on the grounds, might praise their success. Estate management was your husband's responsibility, but you might be involved if he was away or incompetent. The estate had to be run efficiently. Rents had to be collected from tenant farmers. Repairs had to be authorized. Disputes had to be settled. Fields had to be managed, crops rotated, livestock bought and sold. It was a business, and a badly managed estate could slide into debt despite having thousands of acres. Some landowners took their responsibilities seriously, improving their estates, investing in better farming techniques, treating their tenants fairly. Others were absentee landlords, spending all their time in London or abroad, leaving everything to stewards and watching their estates decline. You also had social responsibilities to the local area. The great house was the center of the community, and you were expected to be benevolent to a degree. You attended the village church on Sunday, prominently, sitting in the family pew at the front. You contributed to the church's upkeep. You might visit tenants when they were sick, bringing food or medicines. At Christmas, you distributed gifts to the village children, presided over celebrations. You were the Lady Bountiful, dispensing charity. But it was charity from on high, never equality. You were kind to the villagers, but you never forgot that they were beneath you. They certainly never forgot. They tugged their forelocks when you passed, called you "Milady," depended on your goodwill for their survival. The village school, if there was one, might be funded partly by your family. The village doctor might be on your payroll. You had power over these people's lives, and they knew it. Being generous was expected, but it was also self-interest. Happy tenants paid their rents and didn't cause trouble. Unhappy tenants might join labor movements, might rebel. So you made sure to be seen as caring, even if you didn't particularly care. The country house was your domain in a way London never was.
In London, you were part of a larger social world, competitive and judged constantly. At your country estate, you were the undisputed center. The house revolved around you and your family. The estate existed to support you. And for many of the elite, this was the life they preferred. London was necessary. The season had to be done. But the country was home. The land their ancestors had held for centuries. The house full of family portraits and inherited furniture. The villages where their name had been known for generations. This was legacy, permanence, power rooted in the very soil. And you guarded it jealously, passed it to your heirs, and made sure everyone, from the highest guest to the lowest scullery maid, knew exactly who was in charge. Yet even with country estates as refuges, the London season remained the pinnacle of elite social life, the time when power and pleasure intersected most visibly. The season wasn't just parties. It was politics. It was marriage-making. It was seeing and being seen by everyone who mattered. And it all happened in a few square miles of London, in the fashionable districts where only the right sort of people lived. Your London townhouse was a symbol as much as a residence. Its location mattered immensely. Mayfair, Belgravia, these were the right addresses. Living elsewhere, even if your house was grand, marked you as slightly less than. The houses themselves were elegant Georgian or Victorian buildings, tall and narrow, with multiple floors. The ground floor had the main reception rooms, drawing rooms for entertaining, dining room, perhaps a morning room. The first floor, up a grand staircase, had the family bedrooms and sitting rooms. Higher floors had guest bedrooms and servants' quarters. Basements held the kitchens, servants' hall, wine cellars, storage. The houses were beautifully appointed, with fine furniture, paintings by notable artists, silk wallpaper, enormous mirrors. But they were also cramped by the standards of your country estate. London houses had to fit on narrow city lots, so rooms were smaller, stacked vertically. You spent more time going up and down stairs in London than you ever did in the country. The season followed a rhythm. It opened in May, when Parliament returned and everyone returned from their country estates. For the next 3 months, your calendar was impossibly full. Every night there were multiple events, and you had to carefully choose which to attend. Miss an important ball, and you'd be talked about. Attend the wrong event, and you'd waste an evening that could have been spent more strategically. Balls were the centerpiece. The great hostesses competed to throw the most lavish balls, to have the best music, the most distinguished guest lists, the most talked about events. A ball at Devonshire House or Grosvenor House was a coup to attend. Hundreds of guests, sometimes over 1,000, crammed into houses for an evening of dancing, eating, drinking, and, most importantly, networking. You wore your finest jewels, your most fashionable gown. You danced until dawn, or until your feet gave out, whichever came first. Opera and theater were regular occurrences. The elite had season boxes at Covent Garden and other fashionable venues. But you didn't go to actually watch the performance, not primarily. You went to be seen, to socialize. Opera boxes faced each other as much as they faced the stage. You'd spend the evening looking through opera glasses, not at the singers, but at other boxes, noting who was there, who they were with, what they were wearing. During intervals, you'd visit other boxes, gossiping, making connections. The performance itself was almost incidental. The season followed a rhythm. It opened in May, when Parliament returned and everyone returned from their country estates. For the next 3 months, your calendar was impossibly full. Every night there were multiple events, and you had to carefully choose which to attend. Miss an important ball, and you'd be talked about. Attend the wrong event, and you'd waste an evening that could have been spent more strategically. Balls were the centerpiece. The great hostesses competed to throw the most lavish balls, to have the best music, the most distinguished guest lists, the most talked about events. A ball at Devonshire House or Grosvenor House was a coup to attend. Hundreds of guests, sometimes over 1,000, crammed into houses for an evening of dancing, eating, drinking, and, most importantly, networking. You wore your finest jewels, your most fashionable gown. You danced until dawn, or until your feet gave out, whichever came first. Opera and theater were regular occurrences.
Gentlemen had their clubs, bastions of masculine privilege where women could never enter. White's, Brooks's, the Carlton, Boodle's. Each club had its character, its political affiliation, its membership requirements. Men spent afternoons and evenings at their clubs, reading newspapers, discussing politics, gambling. Some of the gambling was ruinous. Men lost estates on a turn of the cards. But that was part of the thrill, the demonstration of wealth and nerve. Being blackballed from a club, denied membership, was a social disaster. Clubs were where power was exercised, where decisions were made about who would get positions, whose son would be recommended for what post. Hyde Park was the outdoor stage for the elite. In late afternoon, Rotten Row, the wide riding path in the park, became a promenade. Everyone who was anyone rode or drove through the park, seeing and being seen. Women rode side saddle in elegant riding habits. Men rode fine horses. Carriages processed slowly, occupants bowing to acquaintances. This was where you showed off your horsemanship, your equipage, your fashion. Not riding in the park during the season meant you weren't really part of society. Ascot, the royal horse races, was a crucial event. The royal family attended, and so did everyone else of consequence. Women wore their most fashionable outfits, enormous hats required. Men wore morning dress. The racing itself mattered less than the social spectacle. Who was in the royal enclosure, the most exclusive viewing area? Who had the best box? Whose horse won? Fortunes were wagered, but the social capital gained or lost mattered more than money. The same applied to Henley Regatta, the rowing races on the Thames, and to the Chelsea Flower Show, and to private views at the Royal Academy. These events structured the season, gave it shape. You had to attend them all, be seen at them all, demonstrate that you belonged. By late July, the season wound down. Parliament recessed. The weather turned hot. London in summer was unpleasant, smelly, before modern sanitation. Everyone who could afford it left, returning to their country estates,
heading to fashionable seaside resorts or traveling abroad. The townhouses were closed up, shutters drawn, most servants dismissed or sent back to the country. London emptied, becoming hot and quiet, left to those who had nowhere else to go. But during those 3 months, from May to July, London was the center of the world, at least the world that mattered to the elite. Everything happened there. Careers were made or broken. Marriages were arranged. Political alliances were forged. Money changed hands. Reputations were created and destroyed. And you were part of it, a player in the great game, even if you were also exhausted by it. The constant socializing, the performing, the competition, it wore on everyone. Some people loved it, thrived on the energy and excitement. Others endured it because they had to, because not participating meant social death. And a few simply couldn't keep up, retreated to the country, became reclusive, talked about in pitying tones. But most played the game, year after year, because this was what it meant to be part of the elite. You showed up, you participated, you maintained your position, and you did it all while making it look effortless, as if you were simply enjoying yourself, rather than working harder than many people with actual jobs. Between the social obligations and the estate management, you might think there was no time for leisure. But the elite had leisure in abundance, though even leisure had its rules and purposes. Nothing was purely for enjoyment. Everything had social dimensions, competitive elements, ways of demonstrating wealth and refinement. Travel was one of the primary leisure activities for those who could afford it. The grand tour, sending young men to Europe to visit cultural sites and acquire polish, had been fashionable for centuries and continued into the Victorian era. You might spend a year or more traveling through France, Italy, Greece, seeing ruins and museums, collecting art and antiquities to bring home. This wasn't just tourism. It was education, the final polish on your training as a gentleman. You were expected to return with knowledge of art and architecture, with stories of your adventures, ideally with a more sophisticated understanding of culture. For women, travel was more restricted, but still possible, always accompanied by family or chaperones. You might winter in the south of France for your health. You might visit Baden-Baden or other spa towns to take the waters. You might tour Italy, visiting Rome and Florence and Venice. These trips were lengthy, requiring enormous luggage, servants traveling with you, arrangements made months in advance. But they were also fascinating, opening up a world beyond England's borders. Sports were central to elite leisure, though they varied by gender. For men, there was hunting, shooting, fishing, all requiring extensive land and equipment. Fox hunting was particularly important. Elaborate affairs, where you rode for hours chasing dogs chasing a fox, dressed in distinctive red coats, called pinks confusingly, following rules as strict as any social etiquette. Hunting demonstrated horsemanship, courage, and social standing. You needed the right horse, the right clothes, membership in the right hunt. Cricket and later lawn tennis were summer sports, played at country houses, watched by ladies who sat in the shade and applauded politely. Yachting, for those wealthy enough, meant having your own yacht and racing it at regattas. Women's sports were far more limited. You couldn't do anything too strenuous or unfeminine. Riding was acceptable. Always side saddle in your elegant riding habit. Lawn tennis became acceptable by the late Victorian period, though you played in corsets and long skirts, which limited your mobility. Croquet was popular, gentle enough to be ladylike. Swimming was problematic, requiring special bathing machines and costumes, done only at private beaches or clubs. Running, sweating, any vigorous activity was considered unladylike and unhealthy. You were supposed to be delicate, not athletic.
Intellectual pursuits were acceptable, encouraged even, as long as they weren't too serious. You might collect art, visit galleries, attend lectures. You might read extensively, though novels were considered somewhat frivolous and possibly corrupting. Poetry was more acceptable. Classical literature was best. Some women became quite learned, but they had to be careful not to seem too intellectual, too blue-stocking. That could make you unmarriable, or at least socially difficult. Men had more freedom. They could join scientific societies, publish papers, pursue serious research if they were so inclined. Darwin himself was from the landed gentry, able to pursue his research because he didn't need to work. Many aristocrats dabbled in science, in archaeology, in collecting. Being a patron of the arts was expected. You might commission paintings, support musicians, fund expeditions. This was part of your social responsibility, using your wealth to support culture. And it also burnished your reputation, made you seem sophisticated and generous. Music was encouraged, especially for women. Playing the piano was essential. Singing was lovely. You might perform for guests in your drawing room after dinner, though nothing too elaborate or professional. Being too good at music, like being too intellectual, was suspicious. You were supposed to be accomplished, not a professional. Drawing and painting were similar, acceptable hobbies that demonstrated refinement, but shouldn't be taken too seriously. Charitable work occupied much of elite women's time, or was supposed to. You were expected to be benevolent, to care about the poor, to do something about social problems. But your charity was carefully circumscribed. You didn't work in factories or visit slums. That would be inappropriate and dangerous. Instead, you supported charities financially, attended fundraising events, perhaps visited the respectable poor in their homes to distribute food or moral instruction. You might organize charity bazaars where goods were sold to raise money. You might sit on committees for hospitals or orphanages. This work was real and often valuable. Elite patronage funded many Victorian charitable institutions. But it was also self-serving. It made you look good, demonstrated your moral worth, filled your time with acceptable activities. And it reinforced the social hierarchy. You were the benefactor. They were the recipients. The distance between you was never forgotten. Collecting was a passion for many. You might collect paintings, creating galleries in your homes. You might collect antiquities, bringing back pieces from your travels. You might collect rare books, filling your library with first editions. You might collect specimens if you had scientific interests, butterflies or minerals or fossils. These collections were displayed, shown to guests, cataloged. They were conversation pieces and status symbols, proof of your wealth and taste. Gambling was a vice and a pastime.
tolerated for men, scandalous for women. Men gambled at their clubs, betting enormous sums on cards or dice. They bet on races, on elections, on almost anything. Some fortunes were lost this way. Estates gambled away in a single night. But gambling was also social, something you did with friends, a way of demonstrating your nerve and wealth. Losing gracefully was important. Showing distress about losses was unmanly. Gambling debts were debts of honor, paid before any other obligation. Women who gambled were looked at askance, considered fast or disreputable. A lady might make small wagers, might play card games for small stakes in her drawing room, but serious gambling was for men. This double standard applied to many vices. All of these leisure activities, the travel, the sports, the collecting, the cultural pursuits, they filled your time and gave your life shape. But they also served social purposes. Everything you did was observed, judged, interpreted. You couldn't simply do things for enjoyment. You had to consider how they would look, what they said about you, how they affected your position in society. Even leisure was work in its way, another performance in the endless theater of elite life. But beneath the glittering surface, behind the silk curtains and the servants and the endless social rounds, life for the Victorian elite was not always as perfect as it appeared. There were cracks in the facade, dark undercurrents that polite society preferred not to acknowledge, but which everyone knew existed. The pressure to maintain appearances, to live up to impossibly high standards, took its toll. Money, despite appearances, was often a problem. You might have an enormous estate and a ground townhouse, but if the estate wasn't profitable, if the rents from tenants didn't cover your expenses, if your father had gambled away half the family fortune, you could be in serious financial trouble. And you couldn't admit it. Admitting financial problems was shameful, suggested poor management or bad luck. So you continued to spend, to host lavish parties, to dress in expensive clothes, to maintain your position, even as debts mounted. Some families mortgaged their estates, taking loans against future rents. Some sold off parts of the estate, acres and farms, sold to new industrialists eager to buy their way into landedness. Some married for money, specifically seeking spouses from wealthy but less exalted backgrounds. This happened more than people admitted. A titled nobleman with an ancient name but no money would marry the daughter of a factory owner or American railroad magnate. She got the title and social position. He got her money to save his estate. Everyone pretended it was a love match, but everyone knew the truth.
For women especially, unhappy marriages were common and inescapable. You married someone you barely knew, chosen for you based on suitability, and then you were stuck. Divorce was nearly impossible. It required an Act of Parliament until late in the Victorian period, and even then it was scandalous, socially ruinous. So if your husband was cruel, unfaithful, neglectful, you endured. You maintained appearances. You presented a happy face to the world while dying inside. Some women found solace in affairs, though this was dangerous. A woman caught in adultery was destroyed socially. Her husband could divorce her, take her children, leave her with nothing. Men caught in affairs faced few consequences. This double standard was stark and brutal.
Your husband could keep a mistress. Everyone might know about it, and as long as he was discreet, no one cared. You couldn't even dance with the same man twice at a ball without causing talk. Mental health problems were common and hidden. The pressure, the constraints, the lack of purpose or freedom, it broke people. Women especially suffered from what the Victorians called nervousness or hysteria. Depression, anxiety, what we'd now recognize as serious mental health conditions. But there was no real understanding or treatment. You might be sent to rest, kept in your room for weeks. You might be given laudanum, opium-based medicine that was freely available and widely used. Laudanum addiction was epidemic among elite women, though rarely discussed. It numbed the pain, helped you cope, and slowly destroyed you. Scandal could erupt at any moment and ruin generations. An affair discovered, a son who turned out to be illegitimate, a daughter who ran off with someone inappropriate, a financial collapse exposed publicly. When scandal hit, society turned its back with brutal efficiency. You were cut, no longer received, no longer invited. Your name not spoken in polite company. Your daughters couldn't marry well. Your sons were blackballed from clubs. The family name was tarnished, perhaps permanently. Some families never recovered. The emphasis on producing heirs created its own tragedies. Women died in childbirth, often, despite having the best doctors. Or they survived, but their babies didn't. Infant mortality was high, even in wealthy families. You might have 10 children, and only 5 survive to adulthood. Each loss was grief, but you were expected to bear it stoically. Try again. Keep producing until you had enough heirs. The physical toll on women's bodies was enormous. Homosexuality, which existed but couldn't be acknowledged, led to double lives and potential ruin. Men who were attracted to other men had to marry anyway, to produce heirs, to avoid suspicion. They might have secret relationships, but if discovered, the consequences were catastrophic. Oscar Wilde's trial and imprisonment in the 1890s shocked society, not because people didn't know such things happened, but because it became public, unavoidable. Wilde was destroyed, and his case served as a warning. Stay hidden or be ruined. Some younger sons, destined for the church or military but without much interest in either, simply floated through life without purpose. They had money from family, but no role, no real occupation. They drank too much, gambled, drifted from house party to house party, growing old without ever having done anything meaningful. Some daughters never married, becoming spinsters, dependent on family, expected to care for aging parents, never having homes or families of their own. Their lives were quiet tragedies, potential unfulfilled, dreams abandoned. The very wealth and status that made life comfortable also created isolation. You couldn't have real friendships with people outside your class. The gulf was too wide. But within your class, everyone was competing, judging, positioning. True intimacy was rare. You might have family, might have a spouse, but deep connections, genuine understanding, those were hard to find when everyone was performing constantly. And there was the knowledge, even if rarely acknowledged, that your way of life was built on exploitation. The tenants who farmed your land, paid rent, but barely survived. The servants who worked 16-hour days for tiny wages. The colonial subjects in India and Africa, whose labor produced the goods that made Britain wealthy. Your comfortable life existed because thousands of people labored to support it. Most of the elite didn't think about this or justified it with ideas about natural hierarchies, the civilizing mission, their responsibility to care for inferiors. But some felt the weight of it, the unfairness, the moral cost. They might be reformers, supporting better conditions for workers, funding schools, arguing for change. But they rarely gave up their own privilege. Reform, yes. Revolution, never.
The Victorian elite lived in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury, but constrained by expectation, judged constantly, performing endlessly, maintaining a system that was already beginning to crack. And many knew it, sensed that their world was not permanent, that change was coming. They just didn't know how soon or how completely their way of life would be swept away. The Victorian era ended not with Queen Victoria's death in 1901, though that was symbolic, but with the First World War in 1914. The war destroyed the old order, killed off a generation of young men who would have inherited estates, and made the elaborate social system of the Victorian elite suddenly seem absurd and obsolete. The country houses that had been centers of power became white elephants, too expensive to maintain. Many were sold, demolished, or donated to become schools or hospitals. The London townhouses were divided into apartments or sold to new wealth. The season continued in diminished form, but it was never the same. The rigid class system began to break down, slowly at first, then more rapidly. Death taxes, introduced to fund the war effort, made inheriting large estates financially crushing. Land was sold off in vast quantities. The great aristocratic families found themselves asset-rich but cash-poor, owning priceless heirlooms but unable to afford the staff to polish them. Servants, who had been plentiful, became scarce. The war took men, and women who'd worked in service discovered they could earn better wages in factories. After the war, fewer people wanted to be servants. The idea of spending your life in service to another family became less appealing when other options existed. The social changes were even more profound. Women gained more freedom, more rights. The Married Women's Property Acts had given married women control of their own money. The suffrage movement won women the vote. Higher education became available to women. Gradually, painfully slowly, the idea that women existed only to marry and bear children began to erode. The elaborate etiquette that had governed every interaction began to seem ridiculous. Calling cards fell out of use. The rules about chaperoning loosened. Young people began to socialize more freely. The Victorian stuffiness gave way to the more relaxed, if still class-conscious, society of the 20th century. Not that class disappeared. Britain remained deeply class-conscious throughout the 20th century and remains so today. But the absolute dominance of the hereditary aristocracy was broken.
New forms of wealth and power emerged. The meritocracy, imperfect as it was, began to displace the aristocracy of birth. What remains of the Victorian elite today? Some families still hold their estates, open to tourists now, the entry fees helping to pay for maintenance. Some still sit in the House of Lords, though its power is a shadow of what it was. Some titles are still inherited, still carry social cachet. But it's not the same. The great houses are museums now, not homes. The elaborate social rituals are historical curiosities. The absolute certainty that your birth determined your destiny, that's mostly gone. And yet, the Victorian elite left their mark. The buildings they constructed still stand, beautiful and imposing. The art they collected fills museums. The books they wrote and read are still studied. The political and legal systems they created evolved but didn't disappear. Their descendants, in many cases, are still wealthy and influential, though in different ways. And the idea of class, of status, of hierarchy, that's still powerful in Britain and in former British colonies around the world. The Victorian elite were people living in specific historical circumstances, with advantages most of us can barely imagine, and constraints that seem equally foreign. They weren't heroes or villains, just people doing what people do, trying to live good lives, maintain their positions, find meaning and pleasure where they could. Some were kind, generous, thoughtful. Others were selfish, cruel, blind to the suffering around them. Most were probably somewhere in between. Looking back, we can admire the beauty they created, the art and architecture, the refinement of manners. We can also condemn the inequality, the exploitation, the rigidity of the system that privileged a tiny few at the expense of millions. Both reactions are valid. History isn't simple. And the Victorian elite, for all their privilege, were still human. They fell in love, sometimes with the wrong people. They worried about their children. They got sick, felt pain, feared death. They had dreams that went unfulfilled, and regrets they carried to their graves. The silk gowns and grand houses, the balls and the estates, all of that was real. But so were the tears shed in private, the loneliness of loveless marriages, the fear of losing everything, the knowledge that their world was built on foundations they couldn't control. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about those people. The young woman being laced into her corset, preparing for her first ball, hoping desperately that someone suitable will ask her to dance. The young man at boarding school, enduring cold and cruelty, learning to hide his feelings, becoming the gentleman his family expects. The wife managing her household, balancing accounts, organizing dinners, maintaining appearances, even as she wonders if this is all there is. The husband in his club, reading the paper, making decisions that will affect thousands, never questioning his right to do so. They're gone now, all of them, dust and memory. Their houses stand empty or filled with tourists. Their clothes are in museums. Their letters are in archives. But for a moment, as you close your eyes, You can imagine their world. The rustle of silk skirts on marble floors, the clink of crystal glasses raised in toasts, the murmur of conversation in drawing rooms lit by candlelight, the clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestone streets, the tolling of church bells marking time. It's all gone now, but it was real once, as real as your own life. And perhaps in remembering it, in understanding it, we understand a little more about ourselves, about the structures we still live within, about the ways power works and privilege shapes lives. The Victorian elite are history now, but their legacy, for better and worse, is still with us. So rest now. Let these images carry you into dreams. And if you found something in this journey through the past, something that helped you understand, or that simply passed the time peacefully, then like and subscribe. Your support helps us continue exploring these forgotten lives, these vanished worlds. Because history isn't just dates and battles. It's people, living their lives as best they could in circumstances we can barely imagine. Sweet dreams.